My name is David Angelotti. I'm a senior putting instructor here at Sea Island Golf Club in Georgia. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is some patterns that we would see kind of in tour players, specifically one tour player that I've tested, and then, should we change them and how to change them? So wrist motions are, coupled motions. So when we look at wrist motions, we don't want to, see this as individual motions. You can look at them individually, but then you have to pair them together to see what that result is on rotation of the putter and that overall bias for the player. What's coupled are individual joint motions. You have two hands on the putters, and then the body segments, positions, and sequences. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. So what does HackMotion measure? I'm only going to go over what I feel is important relative to putting. So flexion extensions in green, it's the joint motion. It's the main mover in the plane of the golf club, which is one of the most important planes. It primarily affects rotation and affects loft and the main torque. So when I'm looking at HackMotions, I'm primarily looking at the graphs, right? And so one thing that really helped me is if you were to hold your position out, like in the calibrated position, extension works up and the graph also works up. Flexion works down and the graph also works down. So this is not the same stroke. I don't have two units. I just kind of blended two. So this is a tour player's data. And we'll look at this in a little bit, but you can see kind of how those might be coupled if the wrist conditions were very neutral for that player. So ulnar radial is in blue. Again, it's important to have your hands in the position like the picture shows. This is a joint motion as well. Main mover out of the plane. So this is going to primarily affect the lie angle of the putter. It affects path and impact location. So radial, again, upwards, graph will move up, ulnar down, graph will move down. And so not the same stroke, so this one isn't as coupled. So rotation is in purple, open and closed. So this is a segment motion. So HackMotion will measure the global rotation of the forearm. So this means it's measuring the hand's movement throughout space. As far as I understand, it's not a supination, pronation of the forearms. So when we look at lead wrist, trail wrist, the rotation away from the target is open, and then towards the target is closed. So what's important is to combine the graphs and then understand the timing of each of those elements. All of my data that I've taken so far has been in a sterile environment and in this studio, as you can see behind me, on Zen Green Stage, which is 13-foot straight putt. The graphs will change as you add distance, and the graphs will change as you add slope and different contexts to the situation. So why should we measure wrist angles in putting? So we should measure wrist angles in putting because there's subtlety in lower segment sequencing. That's your hands, wrists, and forearms. Which can be difficult to see even by the most experienced of coaches, right? These nuances in timings can even be camouflaged by various hand placements, grip sizes, and then macro elements elsewhere in the body. So number two is this technology that we have today allows us to really debunk theories and theoretical models that have manifested themselves in coaching, such as like engineering model, dead hand stroke, straight back, straight through, steering, under twisting, stuff like that. And so number three is developing the whole system. So a quote from Phil Kenyon, who is my mentor and boss for the Punting Solutions brand, is from a neurological perspective, our sense of touch is an important part of the feedback loop. So the feedback loop is attention, intention, and action. As the hands are a part of the whole system of senses, it makes sense for them to be involved. And lastly, as James Lights would say, why guess when you can measure, right? So pattern recognition. What is a bias? as I mentioned, I'm part of the putting solutions team by Phil Kenyon. I've been working for Phil for a little over the last 3 years. And so what we would define as a bias is an aiming bias, right? And a stroke bias. So an aiming bias is typically combined with 3 things. So you have your visual aspect, you have your body alignment, and you have your stroke biases. I'm putting in putter fitting in this because that's a kind of an integral part of the visual aspect for helping players to aim. So in studio here, what we use is science in motion sports. And typically when we're defining an aiming bias for that player, we will define that relative to the intended start line. So on a straight putt, Sam measures that as 0.0 to the center of the hole. So you can see this tour player that we had a bias of about 2.5 degrees open or to the right of their intended start line. And then face change is 2.6 degrees closed. So that's going to be their stroke bias. So stroke bias is divvied up a little bit more. You have the 3D elements of the club, strike location, how the body is aligned, right? How and what timing that motion happens, grip, hands, and ball position all play an integral part in delivering the face or where you're sending the ball. So when we go back to the SAM graphs, I would always pull up kind of the direction graph at impact. So you can see, like, when we combine this, that player that aims 2.5 degrees to the right, then closes the face from setup into impact appropriately at that 2.5 degrees closed. You can see one putt on the right picture there does deliver left of the hole and would have missed left, but primarily delivering the face very square to their intended start line. The face to path is working in the same direction or the path is working in the same direction as the face angle at impact, or more to the right, or excuse me, the path is working in the same direction as the face aim, which means that the face to path is then closed to that. So when we're looking at wrist structure, we have to look at this as a coordinative structure between everything. So what I have here is PGA Tour player JT Poston. And so JT Poston has won on the PGA Tour. He was kind enough to let me test him for this presentation. We call him the postman because he always delivers. So this right here is JT's setup from the face-on view. And what you'll notice is the kind of the grip alignment and orientation. So JT's wrist is in a lot of ulnar deviation initially at setup. It's also slightly supinated, right, and weaker on grip. That trail hand is then also not as much in ulnar, and then on top, kind of matching orientation. So you can see that in the picture that I have from Phil Kenyon, how those grip alignments and segments are both turned towards the target to the left. So that's going to be important to understanding why this player does what he does and how that face closes from setup to impact. So when I look at HackMotion data, I'm primarily looking not at absolute values, but at the graphs individually and then combining them together. So how I would kind of do this in my own coaching here in the studio, looking at flexion extension first, which is the green graphs. So what we have to take into account is where JT's wrists are at setup. So ulnar, right, supination, pronation, right, kind of matching and turned to the left. Well, from here, that player is aimed to the right. So the club face is open and grip is closed to that. Well, what happens is JT's first mover in the stroke is a lot of flexion and extension. You can see how the address position starts at 0 because it's relative to the player, and then works down, which again, if we go back to flexion extension, graph works down. So this lead wrist works down into the top. And so what I want to do is skip ahead to this first part in the video. As you can see on the left video here, I've kind of blended with GASP lab systems, the setup position, and then about one club head movement back, right? And this blend allows us to see kind of that initial move and that main mover kind of in the plane, which is his flexion and extension. So looking at the graphs individually and then pairing that with video to kind of see that motion and being able to blend like this is something that I'm doing a lot with HackMotion and with GASP. So going back to the lead wrist pattern here, what you'll see is there's not a lot of radial or ulnar deviation. And so what JT does with that lead wrist is it works into flexion, and then he's managing the path, kind of micromanaging that path via a little bit of radial deviation right at the top of the stroke. Because as we'll see as we look on the down view, we'll see displacement from that club. So that managing of that radial is just helping that strike location make sure that it doesn't get too much in the toe for him. So then after I look at flexion and ulnar, we kind of put those together, flexion, extension, ulnar, radial. And this is the third thing that I would look at. And what we're trying to see is what is kind of that, those two combined motions to help describe the rotation or the global rotation of the forearm. So when I'm underturned ulnar, right, both of those are going to get me a little bit of supination through and towards the target. So closing through global rotation. And what happens with that motion, right, is that JT will actually keep the face or the global rotation very, very square or zero on the way back, which actually closes his club face to 2 to 3 degrees on the way back. And then lastly, you put all the graphs together, flexion, extension, ulnar, radial, and rotation, to kind of see how those are acting and working together. So then the trail wrist. This is not the same stroke. I don't have 2 units and I wasn't able to compare these, but the good thing about tour players is that they're very, very consistent in what they do. Their stability is very high. So, you know, when I'm looking at these graphs and I'm trying to pair them together, they don't always match up exactly, and they're not going to always match up depending on, you know, where that orientation of the right wrist is. So with JT here, both his hands are kind of mirrored pretty well. And so you'll see a lot of matchups through this type of motion. So, you know, assuming we have very neutral hand position, if I go into flexion, I'm going to get extension, and that's what we see through number 1 there. And then, you know, as I go into ulnar, right, for him, right, we're getting a little bit of ulnar as well. And then flexion, extension, putting those together, and then the rotation that happens because of those motions. So when we look at this, we kind of piece together, you know, initial move, we have your takeaway, you have transition from takeaway into the downswing into impact, and then total, which would be face change and or the total stroke. So now that you're kind of seeing that motion of that main mover be through in-plane motion for him, let's take a look at the down the line view, right, of this path. So in this video that I have going on, you can see how JT's sweet spot is displaced to the inside, right? If you look really carefully, you can see that the toe also works a little bit down because of that working into ulnar and flexion. And what happens with that, so if I have a slightly open face, okay, and I'm supinated and in ulnar, okay, and I add flexion going back, you can see how that face then rotates and twists shut to the same amount that it was. And so that global rotation for his lead wrist there at address is 0, and into the top of the backswing is still 0. So one note on rotation is that if HackMotion was to use absolute values, that graph would look very, very straight. It wouldn't have much arc or curve to it. So that is relative to their starting position. So you'll always see address position kind of be 0. And so, you know, one more time, just kind of looking at that, you can see how the body is then reacting to some of those motions as well. So now this is from the top of the backswing into impact here. And so what JT does to kind of then hold off the face, because that motion again is closing the face and that global rotation is closing it to the top, he then has to deliver with a little bit of de-loft, right? And hold the face into that position into impact. And so what you'll see, and from the top of the graph into impact, that he's working back into that extension and then holding and de-lofting into impact to manage that face. Because if it were to make it all the way back into an extension away from flexion, that face would close even more, and then he would send the ball even more left of the target than what he does now. So then what happens on that downswing when he goes back into extension there, you can see that that brings the face back to kind of an initial position of where he is at setup. So face change, right, is something that we're always looking at with regards to patterns bias. And that's for ultimately like excess motion through the body, how the motion of the body is affecting that joint motion at the wrists. And so that's why I mentioned earlier that, you know, you can get some of these coupled motions just from excess motions here. And so as this plays through a couple of times, what I want you to notice is the de-loft, right? How he's de-lofting the putter face, and as a reaction, then kind of falling back. What happens is there we go on the down the line view, you can see that there's some global twist, right? And a little bit of, you know, hand path working in and up. And then from the above view, you can see how he then moves the path in, kind of falls back from there.
David, there was a question. What's the player's miss? What his start line miss is?
So fractionally left. Yeah. So, you know, if we go back here, move this out of the way, right? As this is playing through, you know, the top of the backswing, right? Flexion extension. You can see that that graph is working back towards extension. So it's still in flexion, right? But it's working towards extension. And if that graph were to allow and go past impact or work past 0 into impact, right? What would happen is that face would close even more. So how he manages that is through that de-loft, right? And allowing that flexion to stay, right? Keeping it forward, right? And so that holds the putter face more open to that path as it's working through. So now what I want to do is go back into a higher handicap golfer. So what I want us to do as a thought experiment is to just look at this player as he goes, right? And try to picture what those graphs would look like, right? So this is what David Orr would call his eye test, right? Kind of see where that grip orientation is, right? And then from there, right, build what those graphs would look like coming back. So this player starts in a fairly neutral position, right? Semi-rotated under, lots of extension through how that lead arm structure is, right? From there, what happens is that player is then pushing back with that lead wrist and lead side. So it goes into more extension. So if you remember from our graph, right, extension works up. So what we can expect to see when we look at this should be that that graph continually works into extension back into the top of the stroke. Well, from there, what happens is the trail side and the trail wrist kind of start applying speed, right, and applying force in what we call a trail arm throw. So for this player, it goes extreme extension, right, and then that pushing of that right side and trail arm throw actually increases extension even more into impact. So what we should see when we look at that green graph individually is that that's working up. So now let's go into this lead wrist pattern here. So when we look, that graph, right, starts in extension at address, right, and then works to the top of the backswing, increases in extension, and then into impact increases even more. And so with this, you can see the player is managing his ulnar radial. So if you look at graph number 2, ulnar radial, you'll see that that is pretty flatlined and he's managing how much he has there. So the main mover is kind of in the plane of the golf club like that. And so putting those together, you can see that he has a lot of rotation going back, right, from those two motions globally because of how much that lead arm is working across his body. And then coupling that together, you'll see kind of the top wrist or the top graph right there, how that green line continues to work into extension all the way into and past impact. And then I measured just a few on his trail wrist as well. And you can see how the trail wrist working back. So this is the blue line, kind of works into flexion, right? And then from there kind of pushes more into impact. So what are some ways to change a pattern, right? And so the things that you have to understand are intention is a huge key in that. So changing someone's grip can change their pattern, changing someone's outlook on other aspects, the macro elements can change their pattern, changing someone's intention of what they're trying to do via a training aid or start line work can change their pattern. So some of the things that I see that can really minimize the pattern to start and get the player to gain a sense for what the wrists are doing. One is by David Orr. So this was golf.com. This is an article that he posted, and this is called this chopsticks drill. So what you use is you use 2 alignment rods underneath your arms and have your hands meet in prayer. What this is going to do is this is going to train you to sequence your torso, upper arms, lower arms, and wrist, and to work them together. So in essence, what this is doing is this is adding different elements of body, i.e. your torso, right, and arm motion to gain more power sources through the stroke. And those, what they'll do is you'll kind of minimize how much rotation, flexion, extension you have through the wrist. Once you take those chopsticks away, what happens is that player's pattern comes right back. But what you'll see that they'll be minimized some. So another one is that I'll use in my coaching is putting pendulum rod by Eyeline Golf. So how I like to use this is to give an example of how is the shaft positioned at address relative to your body? Is it de-lofted? Is it ad-lofted? And then how does that de-loft or ad-loft at setup affect those wrist conditions? And then from there, what I'll have the players do is sequence that back, and they'll typically see that their shaft either outraces the pendulum rod that's in the sternum, that is a fixed radius and or lags behind. And so then giving them that visual of sequencing, just like in chopsticks, where you have sequencing the torso alignment with the club, gives them a better understanding of how those wrists are moving that are positively or negatively impacting those alignments at setup. And then along the same lines of this is the T drill by Phil Kenyon. So this is one of the things that you can really do that's easy. You take two T's, have them form in a cross like this. I used just some masking tape. You can use blue tack as well, where you kind of, it's like a silly putty that you can put that together and really work that through. All we do is we put that in the butt of the club, and then that gives you a good indicator of how that butt of club is working. And so what we'll do is, if let's say an example is a player goes into an extreme amount of flexion through the lead wrist on the way back, you place that T there and then have the pointy end that you would stick in the ground facing the forearm. Well, if that player goes into extreme amount of flexion, that butt of the club is going to move in the opposite direction of that and then poke that player in that forearm, and then they'll get that feedback of that motion. That also gives them a clear understanding of, okay, well, if I don't want to get poked, I need to move that wrist in the opposite direction, and they can start to correlate that. Another similar training aid to this is called a Pro Stroke from the UK. I don't have one particularly, but what this does is that creates almost like an arm lock feature, where then you can feel that wrist motion, whether it's pushing against that or works away from that device there. So these are good to kind of give feedbacks in stroke, right, with that motion. And lastly, what I like to use is HackMotion's biofeedback. It allows you to set parameters between areas that you want to see. So let's go back to that same example of the player that works into an extreme amount of extension and then works into extension on the way back. Well, what you can do is you can place that on there and then set the parameters for where that needs to be. So if you want a little bit more D-loft at setup, right, then you can start to feel, okay, well, this is where that wrist position needs to be. And feeling and hearing gives you really good proprioception for that motion. And then from there, you can set that parameter to stay throughout the stroke, and that'll give that player an example of, okay, well, I went outside of that area and I lost that sound. Well, okay, so if I go back and I hear that sound all the way through, that really helps that player develop those types of feels. And so, what this brings me to is why you should purchase a HackMotion, right? And the biggest thing is its ease of use, right? It literally took me 10 minutes to strap it on, learn flexion extension, radial ulnar, and it takes not even 5 minutes to use in a lesson, right? So placing it on there, seeing the data, seeing the video, and then coupling all of that together, very, very important. It's reasonably priced compared to other 3D systems. It has quality data. So the data that I've seen is very consistent across all the players that I've used. Phil was kind enough to share some data from like Henrik Stenson and Justin Rose and Gary Woodland. So kind of seeing that type of stuff where Gary's a ball striker and he'll really drag the handle through and how that opens the face, and then how Henrik will add radial deviation to match that center of mass moving away from the putter. And then biofeedback is amazing just for any part of your game, not let alone putting. And now they have the trail wrist feature. So, getting kind of one unit here, one unit here, and then having two devices, say your iPhone or your iPad, putting them together and being able to kind of start to appreciate how that motion is coupled across different putts. In summary, absolute values will vary due to calibration, right? So, when I'm looking at the graphs, I'll sometimes have the absolute values right next to the graph, but primarily I'm just looking at the graphs themselves, right? Values will vary from player to player, right? So that will depend on the calibration, how they set up, right? Where their natural risk conditions are as they do it. I particularly look at the graphs, but there's so many different ways to use this. You need to test players on all different types of putts. So for my presentation today, this was all on a straight putt at 13 feet, just to kind of see the differences in those motions. Well, from there, what you need to do is you also need to do right to left putts. So how does that aim bias adapt to that right to left? Does the aim shift up? Does he under read, right? And then how does that stroke bias relate to that? Does that extension, that flexion working into extension into the top of the stroke, does that increase or decrease? Left to right, is it the opposite? Does he then aim lower, right? Aim right and pull it more up the slope. And then doing this from varying distance. Changing the distance definitely changes what happens to those graphs as well. So wrist motion is kind of the signature of the stroke, right? I really suggest that you stop trying to remove it, right? Look at that signature and say, okay, well, how can I positively impact this? Or if I try to remove this, is this going to negatively impact what happens to the club? And then some considerations is, does the wrist motion match the intention and bias, right? Does, as in JT Poston's case, that wrist motion, that closing the face on the way back, matched his aiming bias? So it's a chicken and egg scenario. Which one came first? Did he always have that wrist motion and then the aiming bias shifted? Or did he develop that to transition the face back into impact? And then is it functional, right? As you saw with the player with that lead wrist extension working into the top of the backstroke and into impact, that wasn't a functional bias and that player delivered the face incorrectly. So working on improving those aspects to change that bias, but also seeing that in conjunction with everything else is very important. And I think that's where HackMotion really does a really good job adding to kind of a coach's arsenal.
A few questions here. With someone who aims 2 degrees open, would you try to change him aiming straight, neutral, or change his over rotation at impact?
Yeah, so that's a very loaded question. So with regards to the aiming bias, right? So JT's, I probably wouldn't change, right? It's very consistent in what it does, and then that stable pattern delivers the face correctly. When we have a lot of amateurs come out, right, what you'll see is you'll see an aiming bias to the right like that, and then a pull bias relative, or you'll see better amateurs have an aiming bias to the right and then deliver it slightly right like that. And so if the stroke pattern is delivering the face where it's aimed, then yes, absolutely 100%. I would try to alter the putter, change the alignment structure, change the visual, change how the body is aligned relative to that target, and figure out which one of those 3 elements of visual, body, or stroke I need to address to change that alignment. In other cases, I would say no. And the reason being is because that's probably so ingrained in all the other biases of what they do, where, might underread on a right to left, right? And then overread on a left to right. And then they need that towards sending the ball online towards their intended target.
And then a question about claw grip. Have you noticed interesting things when people change the claw grip, and how does it affect their lead wrist?
So I haven't actually tested the claw grip, but I can talk on this on a theoretical aspect. So, if we have that unit on the trail wrist and you have its calibrated position there, what you're basically doing is you're taking your forearm rotation and taking it to its end range of motion, right there. So it's very similar to its initial position there. And so what would happen when you go into the claw grip for that specific right hand, right, is you're trying to move that mainly in the plane of the golf club with not a lot of rotation. So to get any global rotation this way, I would have to do that from an upper segment, right? So I'd have to do that either via my shoulder, right, and upper arm, and or I would have to do that via a compensation in the body. So what I see for going to a claw grip via rotation is just helps to stabilize that trail wrist. But what I would say is that you need to make sure that there's not if you're going to that there's an actual rotational element that is the problem, i.e. kind of an intentional under twist or an intentional over twist, or the yips relative to that. So I see a lot of players going to the claw when they don't necessarily need to, when it's another element that needs to be changing. But in relative to the actual wrist position, that just helps to reduce forearm rotation and then gets the main mover in the plane of the golf club, which can help a lot.
One is a question about if wrist motion is the signature of a stroke, would you recommend changing the grip?
Yeah, so it depends on the player, right? So one way to change the graphs is to change the grip and to change the intention behind that, right? And what I would say is that most lessons that I'm coming in, I'm touching on the grip, right? I'm getting that position of that lead wrist or trail wrist to be a little bit differently to deliver that face more stably into impact to deliver that. But what I will say is that a lot of that signature can also come from, different body elements like this. Like I can have a push bias via my torso turning on the way back and then moving here when there's nothing necessarily wrong with that individual wrist's motion, right? Or I can have an upper segment where I tilt towards the target and then turn, and then that closes the face into impact. And then again, there's nothing really wrong with that. So it depends on the player, it depends on the context. But most of the time, I would say that changing the grip to change one aspect of flexion, extension, radial ulnar to deliver that club face is okay. You're still going to have a lot of that player's signature. What I mean by that is we're not trying to minimize this so much where you're dead handsing it, where you're trying to maintain everything. A lot of great players have had motion in their body, in their club, and their wrists then react to that, right? So as I mentioned, Gary kind of has that ball striker's look, right? Where he drags the handle and that tends to leave the face a little bit open. And then Henrik's using radial to manage path and strike. So those are okay. And removing that sometimes helps and then sometimes would hurt that player's bias.